If I could ask you a process question, I think you have an interesting perspective stretching back several years on an effort to draw attention to a looming disaster. And yet, as we look back over the last 4 or 5 years, people managed to stay in a fool's paradise for a long time. Even arguably very savvy people could not see the disaster that was being baked into the cake. What have you learned about how to convince people that there is an accumulating, low visibility crisis brewing that's baked into lots of mortgage terms? It's just very hard to see. I suspect when you were trying to sell your land bank to the legislature, you had to do some of this same kind of systemic description and explanation. Have you learned anything about how to explain in a convincing and forceful way one of these diffuse and hard to see phenomena?
Well, first I would say that the legislature's behavior over the prior 6-7 years actually worked in our benefit in getting the land bank passed. There were a lot of people with egg on their face in Columbus that knew that they ignored the early warnings, that they believed what they were being told by people in the financial services industry, that if we got in the way of these loans and the borrowers, that we would make credit more expensive in Ohio, we would hurt Ohio. So the interesting thing about how the land bank got passed is how many people in the room, well, who I'd known personally because some of these prior battles, who were prepared to say, okay, mea culpa, we were wrong, how can we fix it? So that, by the way, worked in our favor. It's a very complex question, and part of the reason you're able to ignore the cries from places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, and, well, not Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, where foreclosure rates were so high, is because as long as the real estate market continued to move in that upward pattern, you could always justify what was going on here, and in Michigan in particular, as just part of a weak market, part of a weak economy, and that's why foreclosure rates are so high. And it's because they were taking our mortgages and they were burying them in the pools of hundreds of thousands, of millions of mortgages that were part of the hotter real estate market so they could hide our losses. They were complex instruments. I'm a local official. I did the best I could, but the reality was this disaster was inevitable. There were too many people, too many participants in this. It was a brilliant scheme. It involved people at the lowest level. It involved the appraisers. It involved mortgage brokers, the local mortgage banks. If you think how many people are involved in this, there were a lot of people that spoke up. There were people in this room who spoke up, but we were local officials. So I don't know what I can tell you besides the fact that I think this disaster was almost inevitable.
Jim, I just want to echo the kudos to you and your staff and to Gus on building a sound policy out of actual sound research. And I hope it does take flight. I'm interested, actually, I guess in my former capacity at the city as a city planning director, we've got 3 or 4 big projects that are going to need a lot of land assembly. The Opportunity Corridor, the rest of Euclid Avenue, the lakefront, and I know that most of this is based on neighborhood housing remediation strategies, but what's your take on the ability of this land bank to be utilized for claiming lands in those areas for future development? And the second part of the question is, what's your take on the city's appetite, particularly the administration's appetite, for allowing that to happen?
Well, I tell you that the legislation is written in such a way, and I want to make sure that you understand that our job is not to supplant existing land bank efforts. We're in existence to supplement existing land banks. So if the city of Cleveland needs property from the land bank, all they have to do is ask for it. Correct, Gus? I mean, the legislation was a moving target, but if they want it, they'll take it back. I know that I don't want you to think that we're only going to be doing the small projects. I mean, actually, we're going to be part of any effort where property is being foreclosed. And I would tell you that once you've identified where those pieces of properties are, you're probably going to communicate that to your planners and to the city of Cleveland, and they're going to work hand in hand with our staff. I mean, the treasurer's staff and the prosecutor's office is going to play a big role in this. We're going to aggressively go after these uncollected property taxes. We mentioned property tax liens later. We're through being in the property tax lien business. We can't afford to do that anymore. I kidded earlier with the term privatization of profit and socialization of loss, but that's in fact what tax lien sales were. They privatized the profit, and as the bids coming in each year got lower and lower, I realized they were socializing the losses because we were getting less for these lien sales. So we're not here to supplant city land banks. Once you've identified what those properties are, you're going to work with the city, we're going to work with the city, and we're going to go after these properties to the best of our ability.
Mr. Rokakis, you spoke in your talk about predatory lending. You referred to, well, how do you define this phrase, and what are some of your examples?
I have a very simple definition for a predatory loan. A predatory loan is a loan that you can't afford. It's very simple. Now, there's something called a subprime loan, and subprime loans have been around for a long time, and those are loans at a higher rate of interest for people who have credit that is in some way impaired. But the subprime loans up through the late 90s typically were affordable. They were always out there. Subprime loans recognize that I've got some problems with my credit, I need some time to repair it, I'll take the higher loan, and in 2 or 3 years I'll come back and I'll try to find a way to make good on my credit and bring the loan rate down. A predatory loan is one of the millions of loans that was made in the last 7, 8 years that were not affordable. Predatory loan is like one of the 24,000 loans waiting to blow up in this county in the next 2 years. There's an effort underway between my office, folks at Neo Can Do, folks from ESOP, folks from NPI. There's a broad consortium of folks who have identified mortgages that we think are going to get very ugly in the next 2 years, actually beginning January of 09 to December of 10. Now, the folks at ESOP have been out in Detroit Shoreway door knocking because they've identified those folks. One of the things we hope to do in our program, the foreclosure prevention program, is to mail letters to every one of these 24,000 people, say that through our research we've determined that your loan has characteristics that we think might make it difficult for you to make good on the payment, and invite them to a series of meetings around the county by region where we can bring them in and see if we can't fit them into one of the president's 2 new programs, or perhaps other programs we're offering. Those 24,000 loans make up 5% of the Cuyahoga County mortgage market. So it's not over. And those loans we think are predatory. They call them in many cases exploding arms, because they're not just adjustable rate mortgages that move up slightly, they really blow up in the face of the consumer.
Jim, my question is about the victims of foreclosure. And are they being, you sort of referred in the last question that you're following it or tracking it and so forth. Are they becoming homeless? Are they bunking with relatives and friends? Are they leaving Cuyahoga County? What happens?
Well, it's an interesting question. The international press has descended upon this city, and they've been here for about the last year and a half. My favorite crew was the German crew from the newspaper called, I can't pronounce it, but is it Die Zeit? D-I-E-Z-E-I-T? Those of you, I don't know, whatever, Die Zeit. And as the interview ended, they said, could you please take us to the tent cities? And I looked at her, I said, what do you mean tent cities? She said, you know, where the homeless people are living. They thought we were going to drive them to a location under the high-level bridge where there would be hundreds of tents bivouacked, right, and people living in them. And I had to explain to her that, you know, we have an oversupply of housing, and as horrible as this all sounds, I mean, we've always had some homeless, but those tend to be, generally, not people who have been foreclosed. They're homeless for a variety of other reasons, but they end up in other, you know, rental properties, end up with family. For up until this whole thing blew up about a year and a half ago, probably just went out and bought another house. So we have an oversupply of housing. So the folks from Germany thought the same thing. By the way, speaking of international press, I'm going to divert just for a second. There's been a lot of angst in this town over the past 2 months over the cover story in the Sunday New York Times. The cover story in the Sunday New York Times is about Cleveland. I think it's entitled Foreclosureville.